It was not that long ago that many people wore masks. And the reason is because they were afraid of COVID. In fact, not only were they afraid of COVID, but people distanced themselves from one another. And even more so, there were attacks on people who, for whatever reason, were suspected of passing COVID on. There were Asian people who felt very threatened during that time. We have that experience, but that really is nothing like the experience of leprosy. I don't think we can even begin to comprehend how dread that disease was. It doesn't exist really among us anymore. In fact, it's not even called leprosy. In the United States and in Europe, it's called Hansen's disease. And the last leprosarium, the last leper hospital, closed in the late 1970s down in southern Louisiana. We don't even experience anymore that disease in the United States. There are still areas of the world where it's dreaded and it does its damage. But it's nothing that we really are familiar with. Literally, what happens with leprosy is that the disease eats the body away, beginning with the soft flesh. So their ears slowly disappear, their nose, their fingers, their toes. They slowly die as their body gets eaten away. And oftentimes, in ancient times, lepers died not so much from the leprosy, but rather because they starved to death. They were unable to feed themselves because of the leprosy. They lost the ability to get food to their mouths. And because they had to live apart, the only way they could get food was by scavenging it where people weren't around. At night, they could go into the fields and gather. They could go into the orchards, but they had to stay away from people. Anytime anyone came close, they had to yell out, "Unclean, unclean." And anyone who had leprosy, who approached someone who was well, put themselves at risk of being put to death. That's how frightening that disease was in the ancient world. In fact, oftentimes when someone was diagnosed with leprosy, they were given a funeral. They were placed on a bier and carried to the cemetery. They were prayed over, and then they were left there because they were as good as dead. And most families had no contact with them afterwards. I just want to make a point of how dread that disease was. Because what really strikes me, what I find amazing about the gospel story today, is that, first of all, the leper approaches Jesus. That he takes that risk, that somehow he has heard about Jesus or heard Jesus from a distance and was so attracted to him that he trusted that he would not be put to death, that somehow he would find a welcome from him. And so he approaches Jesus and kneels down and begs for healing. And Jesus could have just used a word and said, "Be healed." But he doesn't do that. He reaches out and touches him. And again, under the law, Jesus could have been put to death as well. And yet, the two of them take that risk to bring about healing, to make the one who had leprosy, who lived at the edge of society, to make him whole. And I just find that a real moving moment. Now, one of the things that came to mind was a story of several years ago when I was pastor in Jackson. It was a Sunday morning, and after the 9:30 Mass, one of the more recent widows came up to greet me at the side door where I was standing. And I just one look at her, and I could tell she was having a tough time. And I said, "You doing okay?" And she said, No. No. And I said, "Do you mind if I give you a hug?" She said, "I'd love it." And so we gave each other a hug, and as I was hugging her, she said the most heartbreaking words. She said, "You know, Father, no one touches me anymore." No one touches me anymore. That somehow being a widow was almost like she had some disease that could be spread. That Sunday and thereafter, she always met me either at the front door or the side door, whichever. If I had Mass, I was at the front door. Not, I was at the side door. And we would always exchange a hug, and there would be several others, and they became known as Father Dave's widows. But I loved it. I loved it. Yeah. I think of how many other people out there are in desperate need of being touched, in desperate need of somehow being included. Who are the lepers in our society? Who are the ones who we consider outcasts, untouchable, unclean, that we have to keep them away? You know, do they belong to a different racial group or different gender or their gender preference? Are they people who somehow are less than legal, who are migrants, who are seeking shelter from violence? Who are the lepers in our society today? And who are in need of that touch? Who are in need of being reached out to and being included instead of excluded? It is an important thing to keep in mind because you, my brothers and sisters, you and I are all called to be imitators of Christ. I love that line in St. Paul. You know, how bold for him to say, "Be imitators of me as I am an imitator of Christ." Which one of us can say to those we love, those around us, "Be imitators of us because we imitate Christ"? How closely do we do that? You know, and sometimes we think that it takes a great effort, but sometimes not. The opportunities are there all the time. They're around us everywhere we turn. The opportunity to be God's mercy, God's compassion, God's kindness to someone in need, someone whose life has become difficult, someone whose life has put them at the edges of society or the edges of friendship. There's a story that I ran across in preparing for the homily this week, and I love the story, and I'm going to repeat it because I love the story. It's a story of a man named Joe who was on the streets of Brooklyn and collapsed. Probably had a heart attack, was rushed to the hospital, and there he lingered between life and death. He was heavily sedated, and the hospital, trying to find family, found in his belongings that he had on him a tattered letter from a son who was obviously in the Marines. And so the hospital made an effort to contact the son. Well, the nurse who was doing the night duty the night that Joe was really in bad shape was standing there when the elevator doors opened and there was a young Marine came dressed in his uniform. She got so excited. She said, "Oh, you're here. Good. Please, come on in." And so she took him into Joe's room. She said, Joe, your son is here. Your son is here." And he kind of opened his eyes and looked, but you could tell he was unfocused. And he saw the Marine uniform, and he settled back in, and there was a smile on his face. And the young Marine sat down and grabbed Joe's hand and held it. And during the night, the nurse came in to check on Joe. And she would say, "Go get something to drink. Go get something to eat. You must be tired after your journey here." And he wouldn't leave. He just held Joe's hands. And every now and then he would say something to him. And shortly before dawn, the nurse came in, and Joe had died. And she turned to the young Marine and she said, "I am so sorry for your loss." And the young Marine said, "Who is he?" And she said, "You mean this isn't your father?" And he said, No, I don't know who he is. I came to see somebody else, but I could see that I was needed, and so I stayed. I made sure he wasn't alone. I just made sure that someone was there to hold his hand. You know, it was an act of generosity and kindness that, in some respects, cost very little. But it made Joe's passing so much easier. And the comment that the young man made to the nurse was so telling. He said, "I could see he needed his son. And so I decided that for a while I would be his son." My brothers and sisters, there are people out there, people like my friend who was the widow. People out there who live at the edge of society. People out there who need a brother or a sister or a son or a daughter, who need someone to reach out and touch them in a way that brings life. Be imitators, St. Paul said. Be imitators of Christ, who risked his own life by reaching out to touch a leper. You and I will not risk our life to do that, but we can reach out and make a difference to another. The opportunities are there for anyone willing to look. The opportunities to be a son or a brother. The opportunity to be a daughter or a sister. The opportunities to be God's mercy are there at every step of our life.